The room smelled like antiseptic and old paper, and the chair they had put him in was exactly the kind of chair you design when you want a person to feel small. John Marin sat in it anyway. He'd sat in worse. The table between him and the doctor was a pale gray rectangle, government issue, the kind of furniture that had no opinion about you. On it sat a single manila folder and a glass of water John hadn't touched. Across the table, Doctor. Odell arranged his papers with the careful precision of a man who believed that order was a form of power. He was tall, narrow-shouldered, with eyes the color of deep ocean water. Not blue, exactly. Something colder. "Let's begin," Odell said. He didn't ask, he announced. John looked at the two-way mirror on his left and wondered who was watching. He'd been in this building, this particular Faraday cage basement of the Meridian Contact Authority's London Annex, for 6 hours. He had not been told why. He had been told only that the interview was voluntary, which was the kind of thing you say to a person when it is not. "Mr. Marin," Odell opened the folder. "Your file is unusual. I've heard that. You served 4 years as a field interpreter with the 1st Contact Liaison Corps, Gaian Sector primarily. You were present at the Vashi Station incident. I was. You survived it." John said nothing. Odell let the sit between them like something he had placed there on purpose, and John recognized the technique because he had seen it used before. Not by humans. "I'm going to show you some images," Odell said. He reached into the folder and produced the first card. It was a standard Rorschach ink blot, black and white bilateral symmetry, the kind of shape a mind could project itself onto, see what it wanted to see. Odell held it up. "Tell me what you observe." John looked at the card. What he saw was not what Odell expected him to see. He knew this because he had spent 4 years learning to see the way the architects saw, and the architects did not see the same universe that human beings did. The ink blot looked like 2 hands reaching toward each other. It looked like the moment before a handshake and the moment after a detonation, and to John those 2 things had become the same gesture. "An opening," John said. Odell wrote something down. "An opening, the shape in the center. It's a door." Odell looked at the card. He turned it slightly, as though a new angle might reveal what John was seeing. His expression did not change, but something around his eyes tightened. A small uncertainty, the first crack in the performance. John filed it away. "Interesting," Odell said. He produced the second card. This one was in color, gray and red, with bilateral smears that most subjects reported as butterflies, crabs, body parts in distress. John looked at it for 3 seconds. "A translator," he said. Odell set his pen down. "A translator. The red sections, they're not symmetrical if you look at the negative space. The gray is the message. The red is what gets lost in transmission." John paused. That's what Vashti was, a translation error. For the first time, Odell's posture changed. It was subtle, a fractional forward lean, the kind of movement a predator makes when something has moved in tall grass. John had spent 4 years cataloging that kind of movement in beings that did not have faces in the human sense. So on a human face, it looked almost comical. Almost. "Tell me about Vashti Station," Odell said. John reached for the glass of water and drank half of it. He set it down. He looked at the 2-way mirror, and then he looked back at Odell, and he decided. "No," I said. Odell blinked. "Not yet." John folded his hands on the table. "Show me the rest of the cards." The architects had arrived 11 years ago, which was not what humanity called it. The official designation was the Meridian event. Governments used that language because it was neutral, because it implied a point on a line rather than an arrival, a descent, a choosing. John had been 19 years old when the first contact signal resolved from background noise into something structured, something patient, something that had clearly been waiting a very long time for the signal-to-noise ratio to improve sufficiently for a reply to be worth the effort. The architects were not humanoid. They were not even bilateral. They existed in a sensory register that human beings could only partially map. They perceived electromagnetic spectra that human eyes couldn't resolve. They communicated in layered simultaneous frequencies that no human throat could produce. And they had been watching Earth for approximately 600 years with the mild measuring interest of scientists observing a petri dish in which something unexpectedly complex had begun to grow. They were not hostile. That was the thing that the media never quite got right, and that the governments never quite got wrong enough to be honest about. The architects were not hostile. They were categorical. They sorted things into what mattered and what did not, what was complex enough to merit interaction and what was not, and those categories were not cruel. They were simply vast. The way a galaxy is not cruel when it swallows a solar system. John had been recruited by the Liaison Corps at 23 because he had scored in the 99th percentile on 3 separate nonverbal pattern recognition assessments, and because he had a habit, noted by 2 of his university professors and 1 military psychiatrist, of understanding what people meant rather than what they said. The Corps had told him this was a gift. John had spent 4 years learning it was something closer to a wound. He had learned to think in architect. Not to speak it, no human could, but to think in the directional, layered, nonlinear way that architect cognition operated. The way a chord is not a sequence of notes, but a single simultaneous event. The way a river is not a series of water molecules, but a pattern that persists through constant change. He had learned to hold 3 contextual frames active simultaneously, and to understand that what the architects communicated was never the surface content alone, but always also the shape of the communication, the texture of the attention behind it, the weight of what was left unsaid in each of the 17 registers they used in parallel. He had become, in the Corps' careful phrasing, invaluable. He had become, in his own, something he didn't have a word for in English. The 5th card was the one John had been waiting for. Odell held it up, and John looked at it and felt the bottom of his stomach drop the way it had on Vashti Station when the containment field had failed and the air had started tasting like ozone and copper and something that wasn't quite either. The 5th card was a standard Rorschach, gray and black, larger central mass with lateral projections, but the negative space formed a shape that John knew. He had seen it in 17 different representations across 4 years of fieldwork. It was the architect glyph for assessment, for evaluation, for the particular cognitive act of looking at something and deciding what category it belonged in. He looked at Odell. Odell's eyes had not changed. They were still that deep, cold, not quite blue. Still steady. Still watching him with an attention that was, John now understood, qualitatively different from human attention, wider in spectrum, slower to blink, carrying in its periphery a kind of resonant patience that no human being maintained at rest. "You put that one in on purpose," John said. Odell set the card down. "The glyph in the negative space," John said. "Assessment. You wanted to see if I'd catch it." Odell was quiet for 4 seconds. Human beings, when caught in something, either deflected immediately or went very still. Odell went very still. John had seen that stillness before. He had been in rooms with it before. "Your file notes," Odell said, "that after Vashti you refused all further debriefings, that you submitted your resignation from the Corps via a 1-sentence email, and then spent 3 years traveling, primarily in regions without consistent satellite coverage, that you maintain no social media presence, no registered address, and that you have declined every previous request to participate in the continued contact program. That's accurate. And yet, here you are." John looked at the 2-way mirror. He looked at the glass of water. He looked at the manila folder and the remaining cards and the pen that Odell had set down and not picked back up. "You're not Dr. Odell," John said. The room was very quiet. "Or rather," John continued, "Odell is a designation that maps imperfectly onto what you actually are. The way a translation is never the original. The way a door is a door because of what it opens onto, not because of the wood it's made of." He leaned forward. "You're an architect interface, a contact surface. You're using Odell the way the Corps used me, as a translator, a shape that the other side can understand." The thing that had been presenting as Dr. Odell set its hands flat on the table. It was a very human gesture. John suspected it was doing it deliberately, the way you might speak slowly in a language the other person is still learning, giving them time to catch up. "The Vashti Station incident," it said in Odell's voice, "resulted in the deaths of 23 human researchers and 1 architect-designated observer. The human record attributes causation to a containment failure. This attribution is incomplete." John felt something cold move through him that wasn't temperature. "I know," he said. "Tell me what happened." John looked at the first inkblot card, still lying on the table. An opening. A door. "The observer," John said. "The one the architect sent. It wasn't there as a scientist. It was there as an assessor. Doing what that glyph means, deciding what category we fell into. Whether we were complex enough to matter." "Yes. And when the containment field failed, when everything started going wrong and people started dying, it watched. It didn't intervene. It watched." John's voice was level because he had had 3 years to make it level. Because a species that can't maintain its own environment under pressure might not be complex enough to merit continued interaction. Might be, what's the word? Static. like background noise. A pattern that looks structured until the signal degrades, and you see it was always just entropy, Odell said. Yes, that is one framework. But we didn't degrade, John said. That's why you're here. That's why I'm here. He gestured at the cards. This isn't a psychological evaluation. This is another assessment. You're running a second test. Odell, the interface, the contact surface, the translator wearing a borrowed face, tilted its head at an angle that was slightly too large for a human neck. What we saw at Vashti was unexpected, it said. The pattern changed under pressure, became more complex. It paused, and John recognized the pause. An architect searching through 17 simultaneous registers for a word that would translate into a single human frequency without losing too much. More itself, it said finally, not less. John closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about Vashti. He thought about the smell of it, copper and ozone, and the sound of the containment alarms, and Dr. Svensson, not the architect-designated observer, the real one, the human one, running the wrong direction down the corridor because she'd left her inhaler in the lab. And she was asthmatic, and she'd looked at John while running and said, with a kind of furious practicality, someone has to get the data out. The data doesn't die with the building. And John had grabbed the core drive and the backup and the handwritten notation cards because Svensson always wrote the crucial observations by hand because she didn't trust digital systems to hold nuance. He thought about carrying those cards through a corridor that was filling with something he didn't have a word for in English and barely had a word for in architect. A pressure, a wrongness, a hole in the world where the interface between human systems and architect systems had failed to translate correctly, and both sides had paid for the grammar error in blood. He thought about 22 people who hadn't made it out and one architect observer that had watched them die. And he thought about the fact that he had, in 3 years of traveling in regions without satellite coverage, tried very hard to hate the architects for that, and had found, to his own bewilderment, that he couldn't quite manage it, because he understood why they'd watched. He didn't forgive it, but he understood it in the specific, terrible way that you understand a thing when you've spent 4 years learning to think in a different cognitive register. The architects weren't cruel. They were categorical. They needed to know what category we fell into, whether we were complex enough for the contact to be worth the cost. And on Vashti, under pressure, in the worst possible conditions, 23 human beings had demonstrated something that the architects' 600 years of observation had not been able to measure from a distance. They had gotten more complex. Not less, the pattern had not degraded, Dr. Svensson had run back for her inhaler because the data would die without it. Not because she was suicidal, but because the data was more important than the risk, and she had made that calculation in approximately 1 second and had acted on it without hesitation, and the action had been simultaneously irrational by any survival optimization metric and completely coherent by the metric of what actually mattered. That was the thing that didn't translate into any of the 17 architect registers. The thing John had spent 3 years trying to put words to in the solitude of places without satellite coverage. Humans got more themselves when things got worse. The pressure didn't strip the pattern away. It clarified it. He opened his eyes. The second assessment, he said. This one. What are you testing for? Odell placed both hands on the table again, deliberately, giving John time to follow the gesture into its meaning. Whether the pattern persists outside of crisis conditions, it said. Whether what we observed at Vashti was the species or merely the circumstance. John looked at the inkblot cards on the table. The door, the translator, the assessment glyph. You've been running this test on other people, he said. Not just me, many people. Over 18 months. And? Odell considered for a long moment, and John recognized that the consideration was real, not performance, not delay tactic, but an actual processing event taking place in 17 simultaneous registers, most of which he could only sense as a kind of ambient pressure in the room, a fullness like the moment before weather changes. Inconclusive, it said. The pattern is present in many subjects, but the nature of the pattern varies. Some individuals demonstrate complexity under observation that collapses under pressure. Some demonstrate the inverse. You are unusual because your complexity appears. Another pause, another translation struggle, load-bearing. The pressure does not collapse it or inflate it. It simply reveals more of it. John thought about this. You want something from me specifically, he said. Yes, not just an assessment. A function. Yes. John picked up the first card again. The door. The opening. He turned it over in his hands and looked at the back, which was blank, which was always the part of the Rorschach card that no one talked about. The side with no image. The side where you could project nothing because there was nothing to project onto, which was its own kind of test. Vashti failed, he said, because the translation broke down. The interface between human systems and architect systems wasn't robust enough. When things went wrong, the grammar didn't hold. Accurate. You need a better interface. Not a system, John said. A person. Something that can hold both registers simultaneously. That can feel the translation breaking down before it breaks. He set the card down. You need someone who thinks in architect but bleeds human. Who can sit in a room with an architect assessor and understand what it's looking for and also understand what the humans in the next room are actually doing and explain each to the other in real time, in both directions, without losing the nuance in either. Yes, Odell said. That's not a job, John said. That's a condition. Something that might have been acknowledgement moved through Odell's expression briefly, like light through water. It is what you already are, it said. John sat with that for a moment. Outside this building, outside this Faraday cage basement, outside the bureaucratic language of the Meridian Contact Authority, the world was 11 years into a contact event that most of its population experienced as a kind of permanent background anxiety, a low hum of significance they couldn't resolve into meaning. 11 years of knowing that something vast and patient and genuinely alien was watching, measuring, deciding. 11 years of governments negotiating with entities that did not think in the categories that governments were built to engage with. 23 people had died on Vashti Station, and the world had called it a containment failure and filed it away. And the architects had watched those 23 people die and had observed something that changed, apparently, how they categorized the entire species. And none of that information had reached the world's population, which was still living in the low hum, the unresolved signal, the anxiety of not knowing what the test was or whether they were passing it. John thought about Dr. Svensson running back for her inhaler. He thought about the data cards she'd annotated by hand because she didn't trust digital systems to hold nuance. He thought about carrying those cards through a corridor filling with wrongness and thinking, absurdly, that the handwriting itself was data. The pressure of a pen on paper, the particular way she crossed her sevens in the European style, the small drawing of a question mark she made in the margin whenever she was not certain, and was being honest about it. He thought about what it meant that humanity's most significant quality, the one that had caught the architect's attention enough to warrant a second assessment, was not their technology or their mathematics or their art, which were all impressive by various metrics, but the specific way they got more themselves under pressure, the way Dr. Svensson ran toward the thing that was killing people because the data was worth it, the way 23 people in a failing station had, in the minutes before they died, demonstrated more complexity than 600 years of observation from a safe distance had been able to measure. That was the human thing. Not courage, exactly. Courage was a category, a label. This was something that resisted categories. The tendency to become more precisely what you were when everything else was being stripped away. The architects had spent 600 years watching and hadn't seen it until Vashti, because it only showed up when things went wrong, which meant they'd been running the assessment in the wrong conditions, which meant the whole contact program, the careful measured approach of the past 11 years, had been a test designed to measure something that only appeared in conditions the careful measured approach was specifically engineered to prevent. John almost laughed. The contact program, he said. The whole thing, the Meridian event protocols, the liaison core, the controlled first contact framework. It was designed to prevent exactly the conditions under which humanity's most important quality becomes visible. Odell said nothing, which was confirmation. So you've been running a parallel assessment, informal, individual, 16-hour interviews in Faraday cage basements, watching how people engage with inkblot cards. Not because the inkblots tell you anything about our psychology. You know more about our psychology than we do. But because the act of interpretation, the act of saying what you see, reveals the nature of the cognitive register behind the eyes. The test, Odell said carefully, is not the cards. No, John agreed. The test is what you do with the fact that someone is testing you. Whether you collapse into performance or stay yourself. He thought about the last 3 years. The places without satellite coverage. The deliberate simplicity of movement and accommodation. He had thought, at the time, that he was recovering, withdrawing, getting distance from something that had burned him. He had not understood until this room that the years of traveling had been the same process as Vashti, the pressure of absence, of unstructured time, of no role to perform, and no assessment to pass, and that he had come through it more himself than he'd been at 23, not less. "What happens," he said, "if I say yes?" Odell folded its hands. Human gesture, borrowed, worn with a certain care that John found unexpectedly moving. The contact program changes. The framework changes. The interface becomes a paused translation. 17 registers collapsed into one. Honest. Both sides stop performing stability and start communicating actual complexity. That will scare people. Yes, on both sides. The architects are not frightened in the way humans use that word. But there is. Another pause, and John held the silence open for it, gave it room, something analogous. The recognition that a pattern is more complex than your model predicted is disorienting in any cognitive register. John picked up the second card, the translator. The red sections that weren't symmetrical, the gray that was the message, and the red that was what got lost. He thought about loss, about what got left behind in every translation, about Dr. Svensson's handwritten question marks in the margins of her data cards, which he had carried out of a dying station, and which were currently in a safety deposit box in Zurich because he hadn't known what else to do with them and hadn't been able to throw them away. "If I do this," he said, "I need something." Odell waited. The observer, the one who was on Vashti. "I need not a conversation. I need it to know that I know why it watched, that I'm not carrying that as something it did to us. I'm carrying it as the last data point in an assessment that came out in our favor, and I need that framed correctly from the start. No debt, no grievance, a clean translation." Odell was very still for a long time. When it spoke, the voice was still Odell's, but the register behind it had shifted, widened, deepened, picked up frequencies that seemed to press gently against the edges of the room. "The observer," it said, "has been present for this conversation." John looked at the two-way mirror. He looked at it for a long time. Then he nodded, once, at his own reflection, or at what was behind it, the ancient patient measuring attention that had been watching him since he sat down, that had been watching humanity for 600 years, that had watched 23 people die in a station accident, and had seen, in the texture of their dying, something that changed everything. He nodded at it the way Dr. Svensson had looked at him in that corridor, not with forgiveness, exactly, not with absolution, with the particular, furious, human practicality of someone who has assessed the situation and decided what matters and is acting on that decision without waiting for the feeling to resolve first. He picked up the fifth card, the assessment glyph. He held it up so it faced the mirror. "Then we can start," he said. The debrief afterward took 4 hours. Odell, the interface, the contact surface, asked him questions and John answered them, and for the first time in 4 years he answered them completely, without the careful omissions he had maintained through 3 years of silence and deliberate distance. He described Vashti not as a failure, but as a data point. He described Dr. Svensson not as a casualty, but as an example of the pattern in its clearest expression. He described the handwritten cards in the Zurich safety deposit box and the question marks in the margins and why he hadn't been able to throw them away. Somewhere in the third hour, Odell said, "The question marks. What did she mark them on?" John thought about it. Whenever the data was incomplete, whenever she was observing something she didn't have a category for yet, Odell made a note. The architects, it said, do not have an equivalent notation. When data is incomplete, the convention is to withhold the observation until it can be categorized. John considered this. "That's the difference," he said. "Yes." She wrote down what she didn't understand in real time as she didn't understand it. The not knowing was part of the data. Yes, John thought about the question marks, about what it meant to notate your own uncertainty as a feature rather than a flaw, about what kind of cognitive framework produced that habit, and what it implied about how you related to the edges of your own knowledge, about what it looked like to a 600-year-old assessor watching through a two-way mirror, to watch a species that treated the boundaries of its understanding as the most interesting part. "That's what you couldn't measure from a distance," he said. "You could see the mathematics, the art, the technology, but you couldn't see the question marks." Odell set its pen down. "We could not see," it said very carefully, in a voice that had more registers in it than Odell's voice was designed to carry, "what you did at the edges." John sat with that. "Through the wall," Through the Faraday cage, through 11 years of careful measured contact protocols and one catastrophic station failure and 3 years of deliberate absence, he sat with the image of Dr. Svensson running back for her inhaler because the data was worth it. And he sat with the image of her handwriting, the question marks, the small drawings she made whenever she was being honest about what she didn't know. He thought that maybe the question marks were the most human thing he'd ever seen. More human than the courage or the sacrifice or the fury or the love, of which the architects had observed and catalogued and found impressive but insufficient. The question marks, the specific choice to write down what you didn't understand, to make your uncertainty visible, to refuse to wait for certainty before committing the observation to paper, to say, "I don't know what this is," and say it loudly, and keep watching. He thought that if he could translate one thing, just one, through all 17 registers, across the full 600-year distance between what the architects were and what humanity was, it would be that. "I'll do the job," he said. Odell nodded. John reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the table between them. It was a folded piece of paper. Old, soft at the creases, annotated in a precise European hand with data he could no longer read the context of, but had never been willing to discard. In the margin, barely visible, a small question mark with a circle around it. Svensson's notation for the questions she thought were the most important. "I want this in the record," he said. "Whatever record you're keeping, whatever you send back, I want this in it." Odell looked at the piece of paper. It did not touch it. "What does the notation mean?" it said. Not a question exactly, more like an act of observation, of deliberate attention. "It means she didn't know," John said, "and she thought that was worth writing down." The room was very quiet. The Faraday cage hummed its low neutral hum. Somewhere behind the two-way mirror, something vast and patient and genuinely alien looked at the folded piece of paper on a government-issue gray table, and looked at the man who had carried it for 3 years through places without satellite coverage, and updated its model. Not by much, by exactly the amount that honesty requires. John picked up the first inklet card one more time. The door, the opening. The shape that was a door because of what it opened onto, not because of the material it was made of. He set it face down on the table, beside Svensson's paper, and stood up. "Let's go meet the rest of them," he said.